I discovered my HOA had demolished my historic farm buildings while I was deployed overseas, but they had no idea I was about to be sworn in as their new state judge. What would you do if the people who destroyed your family legacy were about to face you in court? Comment below where you're watching from. I never thought I'd return from serving my country to find my family's heritage reduced to rubble. But that's exactly what happened when I pulled into the long gravel driveway of my grandfather's farm last spring. The century-old red barn, where I'd spent countless childhood summers, had vanished, along with the charming stone silo that had stood as a landmark in this valley for generations. In their place were neat piles of debris waiting for removal, as if someone was trying to erase history itself. This 15-acre farm had been in my family since 1890, when my great-great-grandfather built it with his own hands after returning from the Civil War. I inherited it 7 years ago when Grandpa James passed away, but I'd been serving as a military attorney overseas for the past 3 years. The property wasn't just land to me. It was my ancestry, my roots, and the future I'd planned after retiring from service. I parked my truck and stepped out, the smell of fresh sawdust and disturbed earth replacing the familiar sense of hay and aged wood. My service dog Cooper jumped down beside me, sensing my distress as I stood frozen in disbelief. The farmhouse remained standing, at least, though construction equipment surrounded it like vultures circling prey. A woman in designer sunglasses and a tailored pantsuit approached from a sleek SUV parked near what used to be our historic well house. "You must be Captain Richardson," she said, extending a manicured hand that I didn't take. "I'm Victoria Harrington, president of Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. We've been trying to reach you about the necessary property improvements." Improvements? I barely managed to keep my voice steady. "You've demolished buildings that stood for over a century. Historical buildings, my family's buildings." Victoria's professional smile didn't waver. "These structures were deemed unsafe and unsightly according to our community standards. The board voted unanimously last fall to require removal of all outbuildings that don't conform to our architectural guidelines." She gestured around at the neighboring development of massive identical homes that had sprung up during my deployment. Willow Creek Estates is an exclusive community with strict standards to maintain property values. "I'm not part of your community," I said, pulling out my phone to show her the property survey. "This farm predates your development by over 100 years. Victoria tilted her head as if explaining something to a child. "Your property has been incorporated into our jurisdiction through the county rezoning initiative. The notification was sent to this address 6 months ago. When we received no response, we proceeded according to our bylaws." My mind raced. I'd been in a remote military installation with limited communication. Any notices would have gone unopened. "You had no right to touch my property. Where are the original materials from these buildings? Some of that timber was irreplaceable. Disposed of properly, I assure you," Victoria said, checking her watch impatiently. "Now, about your remaining violations. The farmhouse exterior needs to be updated to our approved color palette, and that old pickup truck must be stored out of sight. You have 30 days to comply before fines begin accruing." A balding man in an expensive suit emerged from a nearby car. "Is there a problem, Victoria?" he asked, eyeing me warily. "Edward Blackwell, our HOA attorney," Victoria introduced him. "Captain Richardson seems upset about the beautification project." "Beautification?" I felt my jaw clench. "You destroyed historical structures without permission. That's destruction of private property and possible historical landmark violations." Edward's smile was practiced and cold. "I understand you've been away serving our country, Captain, and we thank you for your service, but the law is quite clear on this matter. The county rezoning ordinance brought your property within our jurisdiction, and our bylaws regarding non-conforming structures are legally binding." I'm an attorney myself, I replied evenly, and I know when someone's overreaching their authority. Victoria's smile tightened. We represent over 200 homeowners, Captain. Our combined influence with local officials is considerable. I suggest you focus on bringing your remaining property into compliance rather than dwelling on outdated structures. Those outdated structures were my family's legacy, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. Cooper pressed against my leg, grounding me as I'd been trained to do when my combat stress rose. And you should know that I've just been appointed to the state court bench. I'm being sworn in next week. The blood drained from Victoria's face so quickly I thought she might faint. Edward's professional demeanor cracked for just an instant before he recovered. A state judgeship? Well, congratulations, but that doesn't change the legal standing of our HOA regulations. Maybe not, I agreed, but it might change how carefully people examine your authority, your methods, and your paperwork. Now, I suggest you both leave. My property immediately. You're trespassing. As they retreated to their vehicles, I heard Victoria hiss at Edward. You said this would be simple. Why didn't you know about this? I stood among the ruins of my family's history, Cooper, vigilant, beside me, and made a promise to myself. This wasn't just about buildings anymore. This was about justice, about the limits of power, and about holding accountable those who abuse their authority. I took out my phone and dialed my old law school friend, who now worked for the State Historical Preservation Society. This battle was just beginning. As I surveyed the devastation around my property, a sick feeling settled in my stomach. The stone foundation where our 1890s barn had stood for generations was now just rubble. The antique farm equipment my grandfather had lovingly restored, gone. The hand-hewn beams that had survived 2 world wars and countless storms, hauled away like common trash. I needed to understand exactly what had happened and what legal grounds I had to fight back. The next morning, I drove to the county records office. After 20 years in military law, I knew the importance of documentation. The small brick building was quiet, with only a few employees working the front desk. A grey-haired woman looked up as I approached. I need to see all records pertaining to the rezoning of the Richardson farm on Old Mill Road, I said, showing her my ID. Also, any permits issued for demolition within the past 3 months. Judge Richardson. I heard you were back, she said, her eyes widening. I'm Margaret Simmons. I worked with your grandfather on the Historical Society before he passed. What's this about demolition? I explained what had happened, watching Margaret's expression shift from surprise to outrage. That's not right, she muttered. Your grandfather registered those buildings with the State Historical Registry. Give me a few minutes. She disappeared into the rows of filing cabinets and returned with several thick folders. The rezoning ordinance did pass last year, she confirmed, pointing to a map. But look here. Historical properties were explicitly excluded from involuntary incorporation. My heart raced as I examined the documents. And my property was already registered as historical? Margaret nodded, pulling out a yellowed certificate. Your grandfather made sure of it back in 2010. Every structure on that property was catalogued and protected. Even with the rezoning, they would have needed special permission from the State Preservation Office and your explicit consent as the owner. So they had no legal right to demolish anything, I said, a strange calm settling over me. Not a chance, Margaret replied. And there's something else you should know. She lowered her voice. This Willow Creek development has been controversial from the start. They've been trying to expand, but they're hemmed in on 3 sides by protected wetlands. Your property is their only path for expansion. Things started clicking into place. So this wasn't about community standards at all. I'd bet my pension it wasn't, Margaret agreed. Check the board members of Willow Creek Estates against the investors in Pinnacle Development Group. I think you'll find some interesting overlap. Armed with copies of everything Margaret could provide, I spent the afternoon at the public library researching Willow Creek Estates and its board members. Cooper lay quietly at my feet as I connected dots that painted a disturbing picture. Victoria Harrington wasn't just the HOA president. Her husband owned Pinnacle Development Group, the company that had built Willow Creek and was now seeking to expand. Edward Blackwell had represented them in 3 previous cases where they'd acquired neighboring properties through questionable means. On my way home, I took a detour past the county courthouse. Judge Franklin, my mentor from years ago, and the man whose retirement had created the vacancy I was filling, still kept office hours, even though he'd officially stepped down. "Thomas Richardson, as I live and breathe," he boomed when I was shown in. "The prodigal son returns to deliver justice to our fair county." After catching up briefly, I laid out the situation with my farm and the HOA. Judge Franklin's jovial expression hardened as he absorbed the details. "This stinks to high heaven," he said finally. "Victoria's husband plays golf with Commissioner Reynolds, who pushed that rezoning ordinance through with minimal public notice. I had my suspicions, but this is beyond the pale. What would you do in my position?" I asked. Judge Franklin stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Carefully document everything. Speak with State Preservation Director Jenkins. She can issue an emergency stay against further demolition or construction. And Thomas," he added, his eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief, "check the easements on your property." "Easements?" I repeated, confused. "Your grandfather was a forward-thinking man. When those developers first came sniffing around 10 years ago, he made certain arrangements. Check the northeast corner of your property, where it borders the development." That evening, as the sun set over my diminished farm, I walked the property line with the survey maps Margaret had provided. At the northeast corner, I found a small utility shed I'd barely noticed before. Inside was an electrical substation, with a weatherproof document case attached to the wall. The paperwork inside made my breath catch, an easement agreement signed by the county and state power authority, granting access across my land for the main electrical supply to what was now Willow Creek Estates. According to the document, my property contained critical infrastructure that serviced the entire development, and the agreement specified that no construction or alteration could occur within 100 yards of this substation without explicit, written permission from the property owner. The demolished barn had been 83 yards from this substation. My phone rang just as I was processing this discovery. It was my friend Lisa from the State Historical Preservation Office. "Thomas, I'm looking at these demolition permits, and something's not right," she said without preamble. "The signature authorizing removal of historically protected structures isn't from our office. Someone forged Director Jenkins' signature. This is a Class 2 felony. Can you document everything and bring it to my swearing-in ceremony on Monday?" I asked. "With pleasure," Lisa replied. "Jenkins is furious. She's already contacted the State Attorney General's office." I hung up and stared at the easement document in my hands, a plan forming in my mind. Victoria and her cronies had demolished my family's heritage, thinking I was too far away to stop them. They had no idea I was about to have the authority to make things right, not through vigilante justice, but through the proper application of the law they thought they could manipulate. Cooper nudged my hand, sensing my shift in mood. I scratched behind his ears. "Don't worry, boy. We're not beaten yet, not by a long shot." My swearing-in ceremony was scheduled for Monday morning at the county courthouse. On Sunday evening, as I pressed my judicial robes and prepared my remarks, a loud knock interrupted my thoughts. Through the window, I spotted Victoria Harrington standing on my porch, arms crossed and foot-tapping impatiently. Beside her stood a man I didn't recognize, holding what appeared to be official documents. I opened the door just enough to address them. "Yes?" "Judge Richardson," Victoria said, her voice sickly sweet. "I wanted to personally deliver these compliance notices before things become awkward for everyone involved. The man thrust a thick envelope toward me. Building Inspector Fletcher, County Code Enforcement. These are violation notices for this structure. Uninhabitable conditions, non-compliant electrical systems, and failure. To maintain historical integrity, you have 72 hours to address these issues or vacate. I took the envelope without opening it. How convenient that you've discovered these violations just days after I confronted you about illegally demolishing my outbuildings. Victoria's smile never reached her eyes. We're simply ensuring all properties in our community meet basic safety standards. The timing is unfortunate, I'm sure, I replied, as is the timing of my appointment to oversee cases in this jurisdiction. Fletcher shifted uncomfortably. Judge or not, codes apply to everyone. Indeed they do, I agreed, including codes against forging state officials' signatures, trespassing, destruction of protected historical property, and filing fraudulent documents. Tell me, Inspector Fletcher, did Commissioner Reynolds send you personally, or was it Mr. Harrington from Pinnacle Development? Fletcher's face reddened. Victoria grabbed his arm. We're done here. You have 72 hours, Judge Richardson, even judicial. Appointments can be reconsidered when the appointee's residence is condemned. As they walked away, Victoria made a call on her cell phone. Though I couldn't hear her words, her gestures were animated and angry. This was escalating faster than I'd anticipated. Monday morning dawned clear and bright. I arrived at the courthouse early, dressed in my military dress uniform rather than civilian clothes. The Great Hall was filled with colleagues, local officials, and community members for the ceremony. I spotted Victoria and Edward in the back row, whispering to Commissioner Reynolds. They seemed surprised to see me so composed. Judge Franklin administered my oath of office, his weathered hands holding the Bible steadily as I swore to uphold justice without fear or favor. As the ceremony concluded, I stepped to the podium for my brief remarks. Justice isn't an abstract concept, I began. It's the foundation upon which our community either stands strong or crumbles. During my military service, I defended American principles abroad. Now I return to defend them here at home, where powerful interests sometimes believe they can operate above the law. Victoria's face darkened. Commissioner Reynolds checked his watch repeatedly. I continued, no one, regardless of wealth, connection, or position, should be able to trample the rights of others. The rule of law must apply equally to all. After the ceremony, Lisa from the Historical Preservation Office approached with Director Jenkins. Congratulations, Your Honor, Lisa said, handing me a thick folder. The documentation you requested, plus emergency preservation orders for what remains of your property. The Attorney General's office wants to speak with you about the forgery and fraud aspects. Before I could respond, my phone rang. The caretaker I'd hired to watch my property while I was at the ceremony. Judge Richardson, there are bulldozers at your farm. They've knocked down the back garden wall and they're heading toward the house. I thanked him and turned to Director Jenkins. They're moving fast. Would you mind accompanying me back to my property? Bring those preservation orders. 20 minutes later, we pulled into my driveway to find 3 bulldozers and a crew of workers surrounding my farmhouse. Victoria stood with her husband, a tall man with silver hair and an expensive suit, directing operations. When she saw my official vehicle approaching, her expression flickered between surprise and determination. Stop all operations immediately, Director Jenkins called out, holding up her credentials. This property is under emergency historical preservation. Orders from the state. Victoria's husband stepped forward. We have emergency condemnation orders signed this morning by Commissioner Reynolds. This structure has been deemed unsafe and must be demolished immediately. I approached calmly, Cooper at my heel. Mr. Harrington, I presume? I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Judge Thomas Richardson. I handed him the folder Lisa had given me. These documents supersede any county condemnation order. State law is quite clear on this hierarchy. This is obstruction, Victoria hissed. We have investors waiting to break ground on Phase 3 next month. Phase 3, I repeated. I wasn't aware Willow Creek Estates had approval for expansion. Mr. Harrington waved dismissively. Formalities. The board approved it last week. On property you don't own, I reminded him. My property, which will be county property once these condemnation orders are executed, Edward Blackwell said, suddenly appearing from behind a bulldozer. Nothing personal, Judge, just business. Fraudulent business, Director Jenkins interjected, based on forged authorizations from my office. I've already spoken with the State Attorney General. They're very interested in how my signature appeared. On documents I never saw. The workers had stopped their machines, watching the confrontation unfold. One of them approached cautiously. Ma'am, is that true? Are these permits forged? Because I'm not losing my contractor's license over this. Before Victoria could respond, police sirens wailed in the distance. The Attorney General's office had moved faster than I expected. Mr. Harrington checked his phone, his face paling. Victoria, we need to leave. Now. This isn't over, Victoria spat as they retreated to their vehicles. You have no idea who you're dealing with. On the contrary, I replied calmly. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, and more importantly, so will the court. As their cars disappeared down my driveway, I surveyed the partial destruction they'd managed to cause in just a short time. The garden wall could be rebuilt. What mattered was that the farmhouse still stood, and with it, my resolve to see justice done, not just for myself, but for anyone else they had bullied and deceived. Director Jenkins touched my arm. Judge Richardson, there's something else. You should know, yours isn't the only historical property they've targeted. We've documented 7 cases in the last 2 years, all following the same pattern. Then it's time someone broke that pattern, I said, watching as police cars began to arrive, permanently. The courtroom fell silent as I entered through the side door. After 6 weeks of investigation, today's hearing would determine whether Victoria Harrington, Edward Blackwell, and Commissioner Reynolds would face a grand jury on charges of fraud, forgery, corruption, and destruction of protected property. As the presiding judge had been a close friend of Commissioner Reynolds for decades, he had recused himself. Judge Eleanor Martinez from the neighboring county had been brought in to ensure impartiality. I took my seat in the witness box rather than behind the bench, a strange reversal that wasn't lost on anyone present. The gallery was packed with reporters, concerned citizens, and at least a dozen homeowners from Willow Creek Estates. Cooper settled at my feet, his presence a calming influence as always. Victoria and her husband sat beside Edward Blackwell at the defense table, their expressions carefully neutral. Commissioner Reynolds sat separately with his own attorney, his normally confident demeanor replaced by nervous finger-tapping. The state's attorney, Sophia Washington, organized her documents methodically at the prosecution table. This court will come to order, announced Judge Martinez. We are here to determine if sufficient evidence exists to bring formal charges against the defendants. Ms. Washington, you may proceed. Sophia stood, her posture impeccable. Your Honor, the state will demonstrate a pattern of corruption, falsification, of documents, and abuse of power spanning years. Our first witness is Judge Thomas Richardson. I was sworn in, acutely aware of Victoria's cold stare as I recounted discovering my demolished farm buildings, the forged historical preservation documents, and the attempted demolition of my farmhouse. And would you explain to the court the significance of this? Sophia asked, presenting the easement document I'd found in the utility shed. This easement, signed by my grandfather in 2010, grants limited access to my property for maintenance of electrical infrastructure serving Willow. Creek Estates. It specifically prohibits any construction or demolition within 100 yards of the substation without written permission from the property owner. Did you give such permission? I did not, nor was I properly notified of any actions being taken on my property while I was deployed overseas. Edward Blackwell conducted the cross-examination himself, his tone condescending. Judge Richardson, isn't it true that notification was sent to your address of record? While I was serving my country overseas, yes. A fact known to Commissioner Reynolds, who attended my deployment ceremony. And isn't it possible, Blackwell continued, that your grandfather simply failed to inform you about agreements he made with Willow Creek Estates? My grandfather kept meticulous records. Furthermore, the signature on your so-called agreement is dated 3 months after his death. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Martinez called for order. Director Jenkins testified next about the forged authorizations, followed by Margaret from the County Records Office, who detailed the irregular handling of my property's rezoning. Most damning was the testimony from Fletcher, the building inspector, who had been promised a lucrative position in Pinnacle Development in exchange for falsifying violation reports. During a brief recess, I stepped into the hallway for some air. A group of Willow Creek residents approached me cautiously. Judge Richardson, I'm Susan Chen, Block C representative, said an elegant older woman. We had no idea what the board was doing. Many of us are former military ourselves. We would never have approved destroying a veteran's property while they were serving overseas. The board meetings, where these decisions supposedly happened, added a tall man beside her. Half of them never occurred. The minutes are fabrications. Would you be willing to testify to that? I asked. They exchanged glances. We already have, Susan replied. Ms. Washington interviewed 23 of us last week. We're scheduled for tomorrow. When court resumed, Victoria's husband was on the stand, increasingly agitated under Sophia's methodical questioning. Mr. Harrington, can you explain why Pinnacle Development filed construction permits for my client's property 3 months before the alleged code violations were discovered? He mopped his brow. Standard procedure. We filed preliminarily to expedite processes. On land you don't own, Sophia pressed. Or did you have reason to believe you would acquire this land? Objection, speculative, Blackwell interjected. I'll rephrase, Sophia said smoothly. Mr. Harrington, did Commissioner Reynolds assure you that the Richardson property would be condemned and available for purchase at a reduced rate? I don't recall specific conversations, he muttered. Perhaps this will refresh your memory. Sophia played an audio recording. Reynolds' voice filled the courtroom. Don't worry about the farm. Once the old buildings are gone, we'll find enough. Violations to condemn the rest. You'll have your expansion by summer. The courtroom erupted. Victoria grabbed Edward's arm, whispering frantically. Commissioner Reynolds stared straight ahead, ashen-faced. Judge Martinez gavelled for order. Where did this recording come from? The northeast corner of my property, I answered when called upon. Where the utility shed houses the electrical substation. It's equipped with security cameras and audio monitoring as required by the power company's safety protocols. Victoria shot to her feet. That's illegal surveillance. Actually, Sophia countered, the easement agreement you referenced in your own documents specifically mentions these security measures and grants the power, company and property owner access to recordings in cases of unauthorized activity. By day's end, Judge Martinez had heard enough. This court finds sufficient evidence to proceed with charges against all defendants. Additionally, I am ordering a full audit of all Willow Creek Estates and Pinnacle Development activities for the past 5 years. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered as the defendants were led away. One thrust a microphone toward me. Judge Richardson, how does it feel to see justice served? I considered my answer carefully. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about restoration. The damage to my property can't be undone, but perhaps this case will prevent similar abuses of power in the future. 6 months later, I stood where my grandfather's barn had once been. The foundation had been relaid, and a team of historical restoration experts were rebuilding it using traditional methods. The costs were being covered by the restitution ordered in the criminal case and subsequent civil settlement. Susan Chen and several other Willow Creek residents had joined me for the barn raising, a tradition my ancestors would have recognized. The Neighborhood Association, under entirely new leadership, had proposed a heritage partnership to preserve the agricultural character that had drawn many residents to the area in the first place. We're thinking of calling it the Richardson Willow Heritage District, Susan explained, showing me the proposal. A model for how development and preservation can coexist respectfully. Commissioner Reynolds had resigned and pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for testimony against Victoria and Edward, who were facing trial for multiple felonies. Mr. Harrington had reached a separate settlement, agreeing to step down from Pinnacle Development and pay substantial penalties. As we watched the first timber beam of the new barn being raised against the blue sky, Cooper leaned against my leg contentedly. Sometimes justice comes through the slow, steady application of law. Sometimes it requires a community coming together to recognize that true value isn't measured in property assessments, but in the heritage we protect and the principles we uphold. The HOA had demolished my buildings, but they had unwittingly helped rebuild something more important, a community's understanding of justice and the true meaning of home. That evening, as the sun painted the rebuilt barn in golden hues, I hosted an informal gathering for everyone who had helped bring justice and restoration to my family's farm. Local craftsmen who'd rebuilt the stone silo, Willow Creek residents who'd testified, even Judge Martinez and Sophia Washington mingled in the courtyard, where my grandfather had once taught me about responsibility and legacy. Lisa, from the Historical Preservation Office, unveiled a bronze plaque designating the property as part of the newly established Veterans Heritage Trail. This site stands as a testament to the importance of protecting our shared history, especially for those who have sacrificed to protect our nation's future, she announced to applause. After the guests departed, I sat on the porch with Cooper, watching fireflies rise from the fields my ancestors had tended. A car approached slowly down the driveway, an unfamiliar sedan with government plates. A young woman in uniform stepped out, carrying a weathered wooden box. Judge Richardson, Captain Emily Reeves, U.S. Army. I served with your unit in your final deployment. I invited her to join me, curious about her unexpected visit. When we cleared the forward base, she explained, placing the box between us, we found this in storage. It's addressed to you, from your grandfather. My hands trembled as I opened the box. Inside lay a folded American flag, my grandfather's pocket watch, and a sealed envelope with my name in his distinctive handwriting. The letter inside read, Thomas, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've returned to the farm. I've always known you'd serve our country before coming home. It's the Richardson way. What you might not know is that I've been fighting a battle of my own against people who value profit over heritage. They'll come for our land while you're away. Count on it. Remember what I taught you. In chess, the most powerful piece is useless. If you don't understand the whole board, I've left pieces in play that you'll find when needed. The farm isn't just buildings and fields. It's a testament to principles worth defending, whether on foreign soil or right here at home. Stand your ground, but remember that true victory isn't defeating enemies. It's building something that outlasts them. Captain Reeves smiled sadly. He mailed this to our base commander 2 weeks before he passed, with instructions to hold it until your service concluded. After she left, I walked the boundaries of my property with Cooper, grandfather's watch in my pocket. The restored buildings stood silhouetted against the night sky, not just reconstructions of what was lost, but symbols of something more profound. The HOA had destroyed physical structures, not knowing that what truly matters can never be demolished by bulldozers or legal maneuvers. My grandfather had understood that all along. He'd placed his pieces on the board, trusting I would find them when needed and complete the game he'd begun. Justice wasn't just in the courtroom verdict. It was in this moment, standing on ancestral soil, honoring the past while building toward tomorrow, guided by principles that no development could pave over.